Left of the box. Oh, okay. So, I have a Twitter friend of mine, Emo Dragon, brought my attention to a segment on TYT. Now, I don't watch TYT regularly anymore, and other from clips that I see on Twitter, I don't even watch YouTube videos of TYT anymore. But Emo Dragon let me know that there was this one that they were doing about a trans columnist. And I was intrigued and was wondering, okay, what could this be about? And fortunately, I still had access to that video because if it's in your recommends and it's live, as long as you don't refresh the page, you can still click on it and still watch it and stuff. And I was able to watch it, but just in case it disappears somehow, I recorded it as well. And yeah, they're talking about a columnist, and she's a trans woman. And the way that they painted her in a light, like the way that they said I watched the whole segment. And after watching that segment, I thought to myself, okay, they found one of the fringe cases because, in every movement, there's always going to be the extremes of the extremes. And because they're saying that she is okay with children like 3-year-olds fully transitioning and surgeries, and oh no, the horror, and that she's okay with kids having surgery, and on and on and on. And I thought, okay, so maybe they found that one fringe case, because TYT is very good at finding those extreme fringe cases. Like not too long ago, they did a segment on one kindergarten class who was using a weird curriculum based on like CRT and socialism or something like that. So they'll find these like super fringe outlier cases and present that like it's some sort of trend, which it's not. It's just like this one-off. And so even in the trans movement and stuff like that, you're going to have people that are really far out there. And knowing TYT the way that I know TYT, I was worried that they found this one case and was presenting it like, oh no, this is a horrible person. This is a trend of where the trans movement is trying to go, and on and on and on. So then I looked up the article that they were referencing. To say they misrepresented it is putting it mildly. Wow. Just they were so far off base from what she was saying. It is what's the word when they purposely mislead you? Misconduct, media misconduct there with how they presented this columnist. So we're going to watch the clip of TYT, and it is about 20 minutes long, but I'll try to jump in from time to time, and we'll actually go over parts of this article, which is a very long article, so we're not going to go over the whole thing, but we'll try jumping back and forth, and hopefully I can get all my points in there. But just absolutely horrid reporting, biased, one-sided reporting on this.
Watch on YouTube, who watch in other places, just put in tyt.com/join on your phone and then check it out later and see if you can or not, okay? Anna.
All right, so there was a piece in New York Magazine, I think worth talking about. So let's get into it. The far right, or at least some elements of the far right, have been fear-mongering about gender clinicians performing sex change surgeries on literal children in order to galvanize hatred toward the trans community. Now, that isn't something that is happening with these gender clinicians. It isn't something that's widespread among children who identify as transgender. But unfortunately now, in a New York Magazine piece, a writer by the name of Andrea Long Chu, who happens to be transgender herself, is arguing that children should be able to get sex change surgeries. But
No, she isn't. Oh, she is not. She did not. say that. No. No, no. I read the article, top to bottom. She said children should have access to care, to sex change care, which would include presenting as the gender you identify with, possibly changing your name, but before a certain age, like not even hormones or puberty blockers when you're a child, like that. No, she said that children at all ages to have access to care. To care.
She goes even further than that, writing in the piece titled "Freedom of Sex, the Moral Case for Letting Trans Kids Change Their Bodies," that, quote, "we must be prepared to defend the idea that, in principle, everyone should have access to sex-changing medical care."
It's right there. Sex-changing medical care. That does not include the word surgery at any age.
Regardless of age, gender identity, social environment, or psychiatric history.
Wow.
Okay, this is the article in question here. So what she is talking about when it comes to psychiatric history in particular is right now, there's a big constraint out there for people who are trans that they have to prove that they suffer from some sort of body dysmorphia or some sort of basically mental health condition in order to qualify for any sort of treatment into trans care. And she feels that type of restriction shouldn't be there, that if somebody feels that they're trans, they shouldn't have to then jump through all these psychiatric hoops of trying to prove that psychologically somehow they have body dysmorphia or something in order to receive the care that they want. The left must reckon with its part in this. So part of... Am I just going to end up reading this whole article? Let's start from the beginning of the article right here. One often hears today that gender is a social construct. The idea sometimes credited to the book Gender Trouble, published in 1990 by a handsome young philosopher named Judith Butler. In fact, sociologists began thinking of gender as a social achievement distinct from sex as early as 1960s. What Butler proposed was more radical, that the repeated citation of gender norms, things like wearing heels or drinking scotch, produce the illusion of a biological sex, just waiting to be infused with meaning. For Butler, gender was performative, a term they borrowed from philosophy of language, where it referred to the sentence that seemed to do things. I promise, for instance, a phrase that rarely makes a promise. Gender, too, was a kind of promise. It's a girl, one that, because it was a non-anchored in biology, had to be constantly reaffirmed through performative acts, thus allowing the dominant norms to be renegotiated or even subverted. Butler's example was drag performance, by which exaggerated the normal rules of gender, acted as an allegory for the way everyone performed gender every day. These ideas were tremendously influential in the formation of gender studies, but two principal criticisms of Butler soon arose. The first was that they had effectively denied the reality of biological sex. After all, there is a big difference between a drag queen and your average woman. The second was Butler had made a gender sound like something you could voluntarily opt into. Butler would spend the better part of their career trying to acknowledge the materiality of sex, even as they downplayed its relevance, while fending off the idea that gender could be assumed through a spontaneous act of will. It was not as if they wrote, one simply woke in the morning, pursued the closet or some more open space for the gender of choice, donned that garment for the day, and then restored the garment to its place at night. What Butler could not have anticipated some 30 years later, people really would be waking up one morning and choosing a new gender. At least this is the impression one gets from the debate now raging in this country over the rights of transgender youth, a rapidly accelerating campaign that has united the far right, the liberal center, and certain feminists on the left. Last year, the worst so far, Republicans introduced hundreds of bills that would ban gender-affirming health care for minors, restrict participation of trans kids in sports, and force schools to out students to their parents. They are increasingly turning their sights on adults. Around half of all transgender youth, some 140,000 kids and teens, now live in a state where minors have, or may soon have, no legal access to gender-affirming care. To whom should they turn? The New York Times regularly runs stories playing up the perils of youth gender medicine. The author of Harry Potter is anxiously projecting her fears of sexual assault onto them from across the sea. The public increasingly believes that what the kid calls gender is really just trouble. Depression, anxiety, autism, family dysfunction, peer pressure, or social media, any of which, not to mention the universal awkwardness of puberty itself, are better explanations for why a child might question their identity. So basically saying, there has to be a reason, a mental health reason, some sort of thing going on in a person's head in order for them to simply just question their gender, other than they simply are a different gender than what was assigned to them at birth, that they just feel, you know what, I'm a girl, or I'm a boy, or I'm neither. That somehow there has to be some sort of explanation as to why they reached this conclusion, other than it is what I feel like inside. The left must reckon with its part in this. It has hung trans rights on the thin peg of gender identity, a concept clumsily adapted from psychiatry and strongly influenced by both gender studies and the born this way tactics of the campaign for marriage equality. This has won us modest gains in the level of social acceptance, but we have largely failed to form a coherent moral account of why someone's gender identity should justify the actual biological interventions that make up gender-affirming care. If gender really is an all-encompassing structure of social norms that produces the illusion of sex, critics ask, why would the affirmation of someone's gender identity entail a change to their biology? As a result, advocates have fallen back on the clinical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, known until about a decade ago as gender identity disorder, defined as the distress felt at the incongruence of gender identity and biological sex. That the idea that trans people fundamentally suffer from mental illness has long been used as psychiatrists to decide who qualifies for transition-related care and who does not. By insisting on the medical validity of diagnosis, progressives have reduced the question of justice to a question of who has the appropriate disease. In so doing, they have given anti-trans movement a powerful tool for systematically pathologizing trans kids. How to respond to all this? Butler's new book, Who's Afraid of Gender, is one attempt, and it promises to ignite another round of public conversation about trans rights when published later this month. They write well of the global panic over gender ideology and acknowledge the theory of gender performativity seems questionable in light of subsequent criticisms. But they continue to treat gender as the more promising terrain for political struggle. One suspects that, even after all these years, Butler is still afraid of sex. They are not alone. Many trans advocates worry that if they concede to the significance of biological sex, as opponents of trans rights deem they do, this will thwart their political claims. The focus on gender, given its substantial psychic and social components, appeared to be more plausible ground for self-determination, but this fear has left a vast swath of political territory open to anti-trans movements, which now hides its repressive goal behind the rhetoric of neutral biological fact. It seems to me this fear we can no longer afford. To confront the reality of biological sex is not, by definition, to swear fealty to the reality. No one knows this better than a child who wishes to have their biological sex changed. We must be able to defend this desire clearly, directly, and crucially, without depending on the idea of gender. Back in the 1970s, sociologists hypothesized, I can do this, hypothesized that the withering away of gender roles in a liberal society would lead to a decline in the number of people who wanted to change their sex. We may now say this hypothesis was wrong. An increase in gender freedom has coincided with a rise in the number of people wishing to change their sex. For these people, sex itself became a site of freedom. This freedom is not unprecedented. Many Americans, though they may not realize it, already enjoy a limited version of the freedom to alter their sexual biology. What is new is the idea that this freedom can be asserted as a universal right by a group as politically disenfranchised by the young. This is why the anti-trans movement is so desperate. It is afraid of what sex might become. So again, we're just basically, what she's saying at this point is the ability for children to just identify which gender and sex they feel like they are inside. It's not about having the surgeries as a 3-year-old to change their sex. Let's go back to this.
Okay. So I want to give you a little more, and then Jenk, share your thoughts. So she says, many Americans, though they may not realize it, already enjoy a limited version of the freedom to alter their sexual biology. What is new is the idea that this freedom can be asserted as a universal right by a group as politically disenfranchised as the young. This is why the anti-trans movement is so desperate. It is afraid of what sex might become.
Again, this is just the ability for children to be able to voice how they're feeling and to maybe start gender affirming care, not surgeries.
So she already kind of like frames it as you are part of the anti-trans movement if you don't co-sign to the idea that children should be able to get sex changed. And by the way, like,
she didn't actually say that. She didn't say that if you don't agree with me, you're anti-trans. That's not what she said.
We're not simply talking about puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. We're talking about literal surgeries.
No, we're not.
Okay.
No, we are not. This is not what the article is talking about. It's not talking about surgeries being done on children. It's talking about gender care, sex change care for children, not surgeries.
So I'm gonna let you weigh in and then I'll share my thoughts.
Yeah, okay, I read the whole piece and it was drivel. Look, I'm trying.
If he's read the whole piece and he thinks it's drivel and he doesn't understand it and he accuses other people of understanding it, then I really question his reading comprehension level.
Really hard not to use harsh language here, but it made no sense at all. It didn't even try to make sense. So
it made sense.
So I was kind of disappointed that people in the, I guess, pseudo-intellectual community look at drivel like this, think it's brilliant or interesting, or don't even understand it. So she kept making the point that anyone who doesn't agree with her is anti-trans and therefore evil and therefore wrong.
She never said that. Jenk has a very weird way of putting words into the mouths of people who push back on their stance, Cenk and Ana's stance, when it comes to trans people, that if we push back at it at all, we're calling them fascists, but we're not. Okay, the author never once said that people who are even anti-trans are evil. She doesn't say that in the article. The article isn't even about that. He is putting words in the article that were not there. She did not frame anything in this article about people who don't agree with her being evil.
She never actually substantiated any of her claims.
Yeah.
She never explained why children, regardless of age, I mean, think about that. What, 3-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 11-year-olds? I mean, what are we talking about here? She said, but she was very, very clear, no age limit at all or psychiatric disorder.
The whole article is explaining what he doesn't seem to get here. And again, she never mentions like specific age when it comes to surgeries and stuff, but she does mention, this doesn't mean that a super young child should automatically get testosterone if they're interested in a football. We'll get to that part in it.
And you should be able to have sex-changing medical care. So I read this incredibly long, boring, uninteresting, wrong piece looking for, because I'm open-minded and I'm pro-trans rights, massively.
Does he even know what that means? Like, does he know what it means to be pro-trans rights? Because a lot of his actions, a lot of the articles, segments that they do about trans people has the opposite effect.
So, historically so, right? We were probably the first show ever that were in favor of trans rights anywhere, okay? So so I'm waiting for her argument. So tell me why children have enough volition to be able to go through sex-changing surgery, because that is a bold claim.
That would be a bold claim if it was in there. So let's just go over, I guess, another part of this article, because I didn't want to necessarily read the entire article, but I don't want to miss the parts that I actually wanted to get to. Well, let's just bear with me while I scan through this. Darn it, I think I'm just going to be ending up reading the whole article. A decade ago, when Time magazine memorably declared the arrival of the transgender tipping point, the public was dimly prepared, let's make this bigger, to accept that trans people were like gay people, that it is safe, legal, and rare. The successive corporate boycott of North Carolina over its 2016 law restricting trans people use of restrooms seemed to bear this out. Even candidate Trump considered bathroom bills a losing issue, but the nation's first pang of a dutiful charity had rapidly subsided, in no small part because the focus has shifted from adults to children. So basically, the right wing was trying to target adults when it came to bathrooms and things of that sort, and it wasn't working. It wasn't doing what they wanted. So then it's like, well, let's change tactic a bit and make it about the kids. We'll target kids. We'll say that this is about keeping kids safe. And that is when a lot of this ramped up. In 2018, The Atlantic published a long cover story by the reporter Jesse Singal called When Children Say They're Trans, focusing on clinical disagreements over how to treat gender-questioning youth. The story provided a template for coverage that would follow it. First, it took what was threatening to become a social issue, hence a question of rights, and turned it back into a medical issue, hence a question of evidence. It then quickly suggested that since the evidence was debatable, so were the rights. Yeah, if you need to have some sort of medical reason in order to transition, then that means it's a right dependent on that you don't have the right to transition if there's no underlying medical reason, is what the right wing is trying to get at, or even a lot of people on the left and the center, apparently. This tactic has been successful. The political center has moved significantly on trans issues. The public now appears to favor protection for trans people from discrimination in employment, housing, and public spaces, in line with the Supreme Court's 2020 ruling in Bostock and Clayton versus Clayton County. But a growing majority of Americans also believe gender is determined by sex at birth, and even more, almost 70%, oppose puberty blockers for trans kids. Three main tendencies compose the anti-trans bloc in America today. The first and most obvious is the religious right, principally Christian movement that holds that trans people are an abomination and that gender ideology is part of a broader leftist conspiracy to corrupt the youth. The second tendency is also obvious. If smaller gender-critical feminists, better known as TERFs, this group has its roots in the lesbian feminism of the 70s. Today, the acronym, which originally stood for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, is used to describe any feminist who justifies her anti-trans views by citing women's rights. These views include the idea of gender must be smashed rather than affirmed, that women constitute a sex class on the basis of their shared biology, and that trans rights frameworks expose NATO women to sexual violence at the hands of trans women who are imagined as predatory males. Most TERFism in the US is imported. TERFs have their strongest foothold in the UK. Now, this next paragraph I found to be super interesting and very descriptive of a couple of hosts on the TYT network that are currently featured in the video that we are watching. But the most insidious source of the anti-trans movement in this country is quite simply liberals. Butler, in their survey of the political landscape, misses the liberal faction altogether. I suspect this is because the anti-trans liberal sees himself as a concerned citizen, not as an ideologue. He is neither radical nor a feminist. He is not so much trans exclusionary as he is broadly skeptical of all social justice movements. He is a trans-agnostic, reactionary liberal, a Tarl. The Tarl's primary concern, to hear him tell it, lies in protecting free speech and civil society from the illiberal forces of the woke left, which, by forcing the orthodoxy of gender down the public's throat and viciously attacking anyone who dares ask questions, is trafficking in censorship, intimidation, and quasi-religious fanaticism. On trans people themselves, the Tarl claims to take no position other than to voice his general empathy for anyone suffering from psychological distress or civil rights violations. Sound familiar? Sounds like a certain group of centrist liberals that we might know. I'm seeing a lot of TYT influence in this statement here. So far, has anyone caught the part where she's like, oh, and trans kids can have surgery? Have we seen that yet? Anything even remotely close to that? No, it's not there. It's not in the article. So far, the biggest thing that she is saying is that trans people shouldn't have to tie getting their care to being diagnosed with some sort of mental illness. So the leading voice for such ideas in the United States is The Times. In the past several years, the paper has vigorously normalized the idea that sustained public debate over the rights of trans kids is not only justified but urgent. In 2022 alone, it devoted more than 28,000 words to the topic of trans youth, including a lengthy New York Times magazine piece by staff where writer Emily Bazelon on the unexplained rise in trans-identified teenagers. These papers paint a consistent picture. Genuine transgender people, its reporters suggest, are a very small clinical population of adults with a verified mental illness whose persistent distress entitles them to gender-affirming care like hormones therapies, transition-related therapies. Trans-identified youth, whose numbers are told are small but growing, are beset by comorbidities like depression or autism spectrum disorder that stymie clear diagnosis, yet they are being rushed into life-changing treatment that many of them may later regret, as evidenced by cautionary tales of people who detransition later in life. To make matters worse, the overheated political moment inflamed by both right-wing backlash and the stringent tactics of trans activists is preventing the medical establishment, which is trusted implicitly, from coming to a sober consensus. At the same time, the paper consistently refuses to treat transition-related care the way it would any other healthcare matter. Last year, the Times ran a story on a small Missouri gender clinic that had been overwhelmed by unrelenting surge in demand. But the paper did not present this as an issue of access, as it is done with the national shortage of affordable home care or the inundation of abortion clinics with out-of-state patients post-Dobbs. Rather, the demand itself was suspect, a result of poorly explained psychological and social forces that had bewildered experts whose warnings were, as usual, being drowned out by activists. Indeed, the average Times reading liberal is left-wing with impressions that, because politics obstruct the slow work of scientific consensus building, trans people's best shot at receiving health care is to stop asking for it. Just talking about more of the people like Jesse Singal who are painting pictures. Trans skeptics have seized on the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, a term proposed by public health researcher Lisa Littman in 2018 to describe children with no history of gender variance who suddenly develop gender dysphoria as a result of social influences and manipulative coping mechanisms. The study was a sham. It surveyed parents, not kids, whom it recruited from trans skeptical communities online, and it assumed that clusters of trans kids were proof of societal contagion as opposed to, say, self-selection. The idea that children were being unduly influenced by the internet was especially rich, coming from participants harvested from a private Facebook group, but the general notion that trans kids have confounding diagnosis and high rates of desistance, the natural fading of systems with age, has proliferated throughout the anti-trans movements. Now, to be clear, the TARL will typically acknowledge the existence of a group of fully developed adults whose medically verified gender dysphoria is so persistent and distressing that the argument for compassionate care outweighs the Hippocratic prohibition on harming perfectly healthy bodies. The basic strategy here is to create a kind of intake form with exactly two boxes on it. Every trans-identified person is either a participant in a craze or certifiably crazy. Checking both boxes is permitted. There is a touch of genius to this approach. It draws a bright line between the kids who say they are trans and the kids who really are, while pathologizing all of them as either delusional or dysphotic. This line is as old as gender medicine itself, which for decades was careful to distinguish impersonators and fetishists from the true transsexuals. So in most cases of gender variance, the TARL informs parents that it is perfectly healthy for boys to wear dresses and for girls to climb trees, regardless of their biological sex, which need not be altered after all. He reassures them that the risk of suicide among trans-identified youth has been inflated by clinical activists trying to blackmail the public. What he means by that is that he does not think most kids are suicidal enough to be trans. In those rare instances of true misery, he advises the practice of watchful waiting, preferring to see the patient through the often irreversible changes of puberty to adulthood, when their childhood experience of gender incongruence will finally acquire a weight of medical evidence. If only she had said something sooner. Basically, a lot of people are, what she's trying to say here is that a lot of people are okay with adults going through the surgery because by that time they're so messed up by being forced to go through a puberty that doesn't match their gender ideology that it's clear that, oh yes, this person is legitimately transgender, as opposed to some of those people who are just part of a fad. You know, we need to separate the legitimate trans people from people who are not legitimately trans by some sort of diagnosis that we're giving them, because the only reason why somebody would legitimately want to transition is because of some sort of overwhelming mental health issue making it impossible to live in the body they currently have. This is obviously not a vision of justice. It is a response plan for an epidemic. This should not surprise us. The very simple fact is that many people believe transgender is something no one in their right mind would ever want to be. The anti-trans bloc has in general targeted children because Americans tend to imagine children both as a front of pure, unadulterated humanity and as ignorant dependents incapable of rational thought or political agency. This has allowed the movement to infantilize not just kids, but all trans people, whom it only wishes to shepherd through the ravages of mental illness and the recklessness of youth. If the liberal skeptic will not assert in mixed company that there should be fewer trans people, he still expects us to agree on basic humanitarian grounds that at least there should not be more. It is quite possible, for instance, to believe that cancer patients should have the access to aggressive treatments with potentially life-altering effects, while also sincerely believing that in a perfect world, no one would have cancer. We will never be able to defend the rights of transgender kids until we understand them purely in their own terms, as full members of society who would like to change their sex. It does not matter where this desire comes from. When the Tarl insinuates again and again that the sudden increase of trans-identified youth is unexplained, he is trying to bait us into thinking trans rights lies just on the other side of a good explanation. But any model of where trans people come from, any at all, is a model that by default calls into question the care of anyone who does not meet its I can read this word in my brain, but not out loud. Profile. This is true of the old psychiatric hypothesis that transsexuality resulted from uteral exposure to maternal sex hormones, as it is of the well-meaning but misguided search for genes that cause gender incongruence. It is most certainly true of the current model of gender identity as consistent, insistent, and persistent, as LGBTQ plus advocates like to say. At best, these theories give us a brief respite from the hail of delegitimizing attacks. They will never save us. We must prepare to defend the idea, in principle, everyone should have access to sex-changing medical care. Medical care, we're not talking surgeries, regardless of age, gender identity, social environment, or psychiatric history. This may strike you as I can read these words in my head, but not out loud necessarily. Virgintenuous task. The good news is that millions of people already believe it. So, again, she's not saying medical surgeries regardless of age. She's saying sex-changing medical care, which includes counseling, hormones when appropriate, puberty blockers when appropriate. But gender care also refers to just being able to present as the gender you identify with, to change your name, to change the clothing you wear, that sort of thing. Back to the video.
It's a very bold.
Like, I wouldn't let kids drink alcohol at 3 years old or 11 years old, etc. But you want me to allow them to change their sex? So I was so.
We're just saying that if a 3-year-old presents as one gender and wants to say that they want to present as in their gender, then let them. If the little boy wants to wear a dress and be called a little girl, then you call her a little girl. If a little girl wants to dress like a boy and be called a little boy, then you call him a boy. That's what they're saying for a 3-year-old.
So curious what argument she had. She never presented one. It was amazing.
The entire article is her argument. It's lots of words there for her argument.
It was the height of arrogance.
Well, she provided examples of what she believes are medical interventions that adults have, which again, she believes can be described as sex change, procedures or medications, for instance, that have an impact on your biological sex. So I'll give you an example that she provided, which really stood out to me because I think that it's to say that this is just meant to maintain the sexual identity of women, I think is It's false. There's more to it than that. So she gives the example of women who are menopausal and who go on hormone replacement therapy. Okay, so I'm gonna give you some examples of what she said about that. Many women, all right, so let's go to graphic 9 here. So many women really did find hormone therapy effective for a wide range of menopausal symptoms, from hot flashes to vaginal atrophy. And in 1992, Premarin was the most prescribed drug in America. That's a hormonal drug. Women, after all, have the right to remain women. Gynecologist Robert A. Wilson had written, they should not have to live as sexual neuters for half their lives. So she provides that as an example of like, look, here are, menopausal women who take hormone therapy in order to maintain their, identity as women. But it's not just simply about that. It's about, let's just keep it real. Menopausal women feel like crap, right? The hot flashes, they're not fun. So sure, if there's a part of it that maintains their beauty to some extent, right? There's some evidence that it keeps your skin clear and whatever. But aside from that, a lot of women who do hormonal therapy like this, it's because of how they're feeling as they're going through menopause and how difficult that process is physically. So,
yeah.
And what does that have to do with their argument about what's happening with kids? Like, where's the connection there?
By the way, we're talking about adults. We're not talking about children.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about changing their biological sex through surgeries, that is not reversible, guys. Like, it is.
But she's not talking about that. And there's another point in here that she makes that really helps to frame it. So this is a story of somebody who, I'll just start from the beginning of this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to read the whole article. Hopefully I don't end up reading the whole article, but this connects into the point that I want to get into. In October 1958, a young woman appeared at the UCLA Department of Psychiatry with an unusual complaint. Angie's, as she's known today, had supple breasts, smooth skin, and a narrow waist. She also had, much to the consternation of her boyfriend, a typical set of male genitalia. In interviews with psychiatrist Robert J. Stoller, Angie's related how she had been raised a boy but had always believed she was a girl, a belief confirmed at puberty when she naturally began developing breasts. Testing showed that Angie's lacked a uterus or ovaries, but that her testes were producing high levels of estrogen, satisfied the doctors surgically replaced her genitalia with a vagina constructed from penile and scrotal tissue. Stoller, who had become quite fond of Angie's, saw evidence for his theory that endocrine system had a strong determining role in a person's conscious or unconscious awareness of their biological sex. So again, this surgery happened to an adult. This is a surgery that happened to an adult. But let's read a little bit further. He and his colleagues in Los Angeles has taken to calling this gender identity. Years later, Angie's casually divulged the truth. At age 12, disturbed by the onset of a perfectly typical male puberty, she had begun taking her mother's estrogen pills. She is not an example of a biological force that subtly and inadvertently influences gender identity, as I had reported, Stoller admitted in a 1967 book, Sex and Gender. She is a transsexual. Angie's had simply told the doctors what they wanted to hear. But why did her mother have estrogen pills in the first place? In passing, Stoller noted that the latter had been prescribed a synthetic estrogen following a total hysterectomy that included her ovaries. In other words, she was one of the millions of 20th century women who would be prescribed estrogen for treating symptoms of menopause. In his 1966 bestseller, Feminine Forever, the gynecologist Robert A. Wilson argued that menopause was basically a hormone deficiency like diabetes that could safely be treated through estrogen therapy. He claimed his patients were part of a new sexual revolution, that they had supple breasts, smooth skin, and legs that looked good in a tennis skirt. After Wilson's death, it would become out that he had been receiving payments from the makers of Paramin. an estrogen medication derived from the urine of pregnant mares. Nevertheless, women really did find hormone therapy effective for a wide range of menopausal symptoms. From hot flashes and so on. So women, after all, have the right to remain women. Wilson had written they should not have to live as asexual neuters. So that's the quote from the TYT article. So when Angie's visited UCLA, she did not need to prove that a right to a female biology existed. She was simply trying to convince the doctors that this right applied to her. In fact, the vast majority of Americans long believed everyone has a right to keep their biological sex. The prospect of forcible sex change is the stuff of horror movies. So everyone has the right to keep their biological sex. Interesting. The prospect of forcible sex change, horror movies. The Times ran a front page story about an anonymous man later identified as David Remire, who was raised a girl after a botched circumcision destroyed his genitals. That's actually a Canadian story. And he later on went to... So during the botched circumcision, they decided that it would be best to just remove his penis completely and raise him as a girl because of how horribly this had gone. And they forced him to wear dresses and referred to him as a girl and all this sort of stuff. And it later came out later on in his life that he was a boy, that he always knew he was, like he had always known he was a boy. And he ended up actually committing suicide because of what he had been through. So his story is popular in the anti-trans literature because alongside the general depravity of the affair, it appears to prove that gender has an inescapable basis in biological sex. David knew he wasn't a girl, no matter what the doctors did to him. He told Oprah Winfrey he had never fit in as a girl, preferring to climb trees and play with trucks, even as his mother tried to convince him that he was simply a tomboy. This, of course, is the exact conversation many trans kids are having with their parents today. What David's story actually illustrates is that we are perfectly comfortable with sex changing when we understand it as changing back. This happens more often than one might think. The historian Jules Gill Peterson has also shown that earliest testaments in the field of gender medicine were developed to correct intersex children by bringing their ambiguous biology within the range of what society considered normal. Even with these treatments, the later were later charily extended to transsexuals. It is often the assumption that some original biological sex, perhaps endocrine and natural and in nature, was being excavated. But as the medical understanding of sex ballooned to include things like gonad development and hormone activity, so did the risk of losing one's sex as a result of age, hereditary disease, physical trauma, and the side effects of medical treatment. This was just the cleverness of Angie's plan. She presented herself as a person who, just like her mother, needed to become female again. In fact, following the removal of her testes, she candidly discontinued her secret estrogen pills, leading to mood swings, hot flashes, and so on. So what it's trying to say is that society is okay when it comes to sex change surgeries when it's changing the person back to where people believe this person should be. So Angie's was able to convince doctors way back when that it was okay for her to have her sex change because she was actually a girl since birth. And, you know, this was just changing her back to that as opposed to she was born with a son, which would typically align with what a male is, and that she needed to change to something that was different than what she was born with. So for some reason, society seems to be okay with one and not the other. Yeah, it skips down to the real question is which sex change can be affirmed and why. It so happens, for instance, that GnRH along with also used to delay puberty in kids. So this means your average Alabama Republican now ostentatiously believes it should be a felony to give a child the same hormone blockers his mother may have used to conceive him. Our politicians may rightly protest that the same drug is being used for very different purposes, but the point is, it is the purpose of sex change and not the change itself which determines its acceptability. And that's the good statement there. It is the purpose of sex change and not the change itself which determines its acceptability. So these types of sex changes happen all the time, but sometimes it's questioned as to why it's okay, and other times it's perfectly fine that people get it. This is why sex-affirming care has historically entailed both withholding of sex change from some and enforcing it onto others. Like most fields of medicine, it has a bloody underbelly of coercion. The vaginal surgeries tested on enslaved women in the 1840s, Alabama, the testicular transplants performed on gay men in Nazi Germany, and surgical modification of infants with atypical genitalia, which continues to this day. So again, so far, has the idea of sex change surgeries happening on children come up at all? That, if a 5-year-old boy says that he is a girl, that means that we should immediately do a sex change surgery on them. That's not in the article.
It is not a small thing. It is serious. It's something that should be taken seriously. And there is a reason why we treat children differently in society, right? For instance, our criminal justice system treats children who might commit a crime, even if it's something as serious as murder. They are treated differently in our criminal justice system for good reason. They do not have the mental maturity to be treated similar to adults. Same goes for the issue of consent. There is a reason why we have laws indicating that children cannot consent to sex with adults. That is a crime.
This is not, look guys, this is not much of a debate. This is absurdity, maximum absurdity. Of course, 7-year-olds can't consent to sex with adults, of course, right? And so do I really need to prove that point? So of course 7-year-olds can't consent to sex change operations. At one point she blithely says, well, if they change their minds later, so what? They could just change it back.
No, they can't.
That's not what she says in this article. So on the idea of consent, there is a point in here. So here she's talking about part of the reason of the construct of why sex is attached to biology and what that means. And let's just skip down. This is a sex as biological capacity in this sense. It is no less of a material resource than water or wheat. Every human society invested in perpetuating itself, which is to say every society, has regulated the production and distribution of use of biological sex. This is more than sex-based division of labor, hunter-gatherer and all that. It is actual division of sex. And so this is, which labor duties fall on people, raising families, all that sort of stuff. So it may sound as if I'm saying sex is more real than gender, as proposition gender studies as abhorred since its inception. I do not think that sex is more real, but I am not terribly bothered by saying that division of sex determines gender norms, so long as we remember that it never remotely finishes determining them. So she says, I am speaking here of a universal birthright, the freedom of sex. This freedom consists of two principal rights, and by sex she means like again, I don't know how much of the thing is that this article is both easy to understand and hard to understand. It's hard to understand if you just skip through it and cursory read it, like I suspect Cenk and Ana did. But it's easy to understand if you actually read the whole thing and absorb what you're reading as you're going through, which is why I'm finding it hard to just skip through different parts to get to one part, because you can read this out of context and it would seem a little off-putting. So that's why I'm trying to find what parts I can just skip to, because it is a long article. So down here, I am speaking here of universal birthright, the freedom of sex. This freedom consists of two principal rights: the right to change one's biological sex without appealing to gender, and the right to assume a gender that is not determined by one's sexual biology. One might exercise both of these rights towards a common goal, transition, for instance, but neither can be collapsed onto the other. I'm in mind of a bimerical system. Each chamber has its own prerogatives, but neither has exclusive upper chamber sex or the boisterous lower chamber gender that has ultimate power to overrule the other. Not all trans people wish to change their sex. Some trans people are also gender nonconforming. So by this, they're talking more about surgeries and things of that sort. By asserting the freedom of sex, we may stop relying on the increasingly metaphysical concept of gender identity to justify sex-changing care, as if such care were only permissible when one's biological sex does not match the serial number engraved on one's soul. The same goes for sex assigned at birth, which unhelpfully obscures the very biological process that many people have a right to change. In general, we must rid ourselves of the idea that any necessary relationship exists between sex and gender, and prepares us to claim that the freedom to bring sex and gender into whatever relation one chooses is a basic human right. In other words, it's okay to be a woman and still have a penis and want to keep that penis. You can still be a woman. One is not intrinsically tied to the other. You do not have to go through hormone treatment and all this sort of stuff in order to identify as the gender you feel inside. And it's also completely fine to be gender nonconforming. What does this freedom look like in practice? Let anyone change their sex. Let anyone change their gender. Let anyone change their sex again. Let trans girl play on sports regardless of their sex status. If they excel, this means that only that some girls are better at sports than others. Let people use the gender-segregated facilities of their choice, desegregate whenever possible. Do not out children to their parents. Do not force anyone to change their sex or their gender. Give everyone health care. The anti-trans movement has collected its public's rising awareness of the staggering injustice of the American healthcare system, directed it like a syringe full of air at the small population of children. The effect is to make it appear as if trans people do not want good healthcare or trustworthy providers, when the truth is that trans people face health disparities across the board, including higher reports of disability, asthma, and heart disease. No single federal program would benefit trans people more than Medicare for All, as received counseling to understand the risks or to be treated for comorbidities. In fact, society has a duty to make these resources freely and widely accessible to trans kids. But these practical options are not obligations to make thoughtfulness a requirement of any universal right to taper that right to exclusive privilege. That trans kids' access to care, again, we're talking care, not surgeries, will in most cases be mediated by parents or legal guardians is inescapable fact of the way our society regards children, rightly or not. For now, parents must learn to treat their kids as what they are, human beings capable of freedom. So from this, Jenk is saying that she is saying that a 5-year-old can undergo surgery and then just change back. That's what she's wanting people to, that's what she's claiming that she wants. That is not what she said. Like, she is saying, let anyone change their gender, let anyone change their sex and change it again. But this isn't in the context of surgeries that she's talking about. And how she connects what gender is, like biological, like the construct of gender and sex, and how she connects them earlier in the article matters when it comes to understanding what she's saying here. And she also says, do not out children to their parents. And of course, Cenk and Ana takes that to mean that they're hiding it from, that it's an automatic. You do not tell parents that a child is transgender, when the phrase "do not out" is important. If a child is hiding who they are from their parents, there's a reason. And we have to go over this over and over and over again. They don't feel safe. They feel like they could be abused, abandoned, neglected, or worse if their parents were to know that they were transgender. So it's important to not out those children to their parents, and also because they are human beings capable of freedom. Children are not property. So here's where I want to also get into consent. If we are to recognize the right of trans kids, we will also have to accept that, like us, they have a right of the hazards of their own free will. This does not mean shooting testosterone into every toddler who looks at a football. But if children are too young to consent to puberty blockers, they are definitely too young to consent to puberty, which is a drastic biological upheaval in its own right. Yet we let this happen every day and not without causalities. I am not speaking of suicide. I am speaking of many opponents of trans rights who observe with horror that they too might have transitioned given the chance. So intensely did they hate being teenage girls. I do not know if they regret their biology today. I do suspect they regret that they never got to choose. So this is about the freedom to choose. And again, it is about receiving the proper care at age-appropriate times. And the fact that people like Cenk and Ana are all against, you gotta be cautious about those puberty blockers and the hormones and stuff because they would undergo irreversible changes if they take those when they are teenagers, while totally neglecting the fact that puberty also puts children through irreversible changes, and that it is very difficult to reverse those changes of puberty afterwards. Whereas if the case from earlier, the person who took the estrogen pills from her mother, she never developed into a muscular man to begin with, and then had to somehow try to reverse that when it's too late. It's important that children undergo the puberty that best fits them. And yes, there are going to be regrets, because when you have the freedom to make a choice, it isn't without the risk of regret. But all too often, it's more people regretting that they never got that choice in the first place. So many trans people growing up, having gone through the puberty that isn't for them, always never being able to go through society the way that they wanted. A choice, the thought is impossible, yet we have no difficulty believing that 300,000 trans kids can choose to stop being trans. Freedom is easy to imagine when it is the freedom to do as you're told. When we cannot conceive is what we cannot conceive is why they're making all these gender troubles in the first place. They do not owe us an explanation. They are busy taking charge of their own creation. They may not change the world, but they will certainly change themselves. Possibility, Butler once wrote, is not a luxury. It is as crucial as bread. We have not yet begun to understand the courage of a child who says she is a girl for the first time without any biological proof to back this up. This is especially true if she lives in one of the many states that are working to ensure that saying so is all that trans kids like her will ever have. But she speaks the sentence, "I am a girl," is performative speech in a classic sense. It performs an action. She is not only declaring her intent to exercise her freedom of sex in the future, she is uttering these words already, exercising it. She is working the weakness in the norm. She is not afraid of sex. She is against it. That is not nothing. There is, in fact, a very important population of Americans who do not want trans kids to exist. I am told they are small but growing.
No, they can't. That's not how sex-changing surgery works. I mean, what a ridiculous thing.
That was startling, just jumping back into that. Oh, no, where we go.
Absurdity. Of course, 7-year-olds can't consent to sex with adults. Of course, right? And do I really sex change their minds later? So what? They could just change it back.
No, they can't.
No, they can't.
They can't.
That's not how sex-changing surgery.
And that is not what the article said.
It works. I mean, what a ridiculous thing to say. What a preposterous thing to say. And then on top of that, even if you just say hormone therapy. Guys, I have a friend, one of my best friends, and his daughter is trans, okay? And they're doing this now.
Well, I can speak to this because I just happen to have a friend who has a trans daughter. So I can speak to this.
Now, she's clearly—
be clear about what they're doing, because
they're doing hormone therapy, okay? And so,
yeah, be clear about what they're doing, which is not something that they're actually, being clear about what the article is stating. The article isn't stating that kids can have surgery.
So I agree with that decision, but the fact that I agree with it is totally irrelevant because it's not my business, it's not my decision. That's
good, then shut the fuck up.
For that family to decide together, okay? So I'm not against it. I'm just saying, to say that it doesn't matter, even if it's just hormone therapy, is absurd because that also changes a person. So if you try to switch it back, you're not switching back to the quote unquote same person, you've changed the person twice. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't, but it means you should be careful about it. You should deliberate.
Yes, because they can never know, they never understand, and yet nobody ever questions when a little boy says that he's a boy and that he wants to make this little boy club with no girls allowed. Nobody ever questions that, and nobody ever questions a little girl when she says that she loves dresses and pink and wants to be a little princess. Nobody ever questions that they understand what their gender is and that what their gender identity is. Nobody ever questions them when it's that. But if it looks like it's a little boy and he says that he's actually a girl, well, then we have to question that. Then they don't know. How can kids possibly know what gender they are? Because suddenly when it's something that they don't understand, then it needs to be questioned because children are incapable of understanding what gender they are unless they are the gender we think they should be. Okay, kids know what gender they are. They know at a young age. But we only ever question it when it's one case and not the other. It's funny how that happens. Like, really, if children are so incapable of knowing what gender they are, then we should just raise everyone as non-binary. We gotta wait and basically till after puberty. Let's just put puberty blockers on until they're an adult, until they're 18. Nobody is allowed to even have puberty because how can a child understand what gender they are? So everyone should just be raised as non-binary because a child cannot understand if they are a girl or a boy. So let's just do that because they're so incapable of figuring that out.
You should take this very seriously and not be flippant. Oh, so what? You can just change it and then change it back. Well, come on. Do you really care about these people? Because you don't sound like it.
And the thing is, so she's transgender herself and she's undergone sex change surgery and she's been very open about it. She's written about it, which is why it kind of befuddles me that she understands the weight of that decision, but thinks that children should be able to make that decision for themselves. So I'm gonna
I guarantee you she knew she was trans when she was a little girl. All the trans people I knew which gender they were when they were children. And their only regret is that they weren't able to go through the puberty that they identified with, that they had to transition when they were adults after irreversible harm had been done to their body, irreversible changes had been done to their body. Their only regret was that they couldn't transition sooner.
Give you a few examples of the work that she's published in the past. By the way, I should also note, soon after she shared this latest piece on X, she also tweeted and then later deleted the following. Let's go to graphic 4 here. Speaking of which, my sweet friend Theo is having painful complications from their surgery last year and urgently needs a revision. Please help out if you can. And then when you click on it, it goes to a GoFundMe for the person who unfortunately and tragically had a botched sex change surgery.
Okay, why bring up that tweet? That's a healthcare issue in the United States that you need to set up GoFundMe pages in order to help out with that. And it wasn't a botched surgery. There are complications from almost every surgery, there can be complications. It doesn't mean that that surgery was botched. It could be a very successful surgery, but there's still a complication later on. And because the American healthcare system is the way it is, they had to set up a GoFundMe page in order to help cover the costs of the complications. It does not mean it was a botched surgery.
So this is not, and look, I don't say this to fearmonger about the surgeries. I say it because this.
Oh, she is absolutely saying that to fearmonger about the surgeries.
This is not a small thing. This is a big thing. This is a big decision. And when it comes to children, the idea that they should decide for themselves and that these, doctors who need a gender dysphoria diagnosis are nothing more than, gatekeepers I just think it's a ridiculous notion, and it's irresponsible to push that idea because again, it minimizes the invasive nature of the surgery. And more importantly, after that surgery is done, let's say, it's a born male wants to transition to female, that person is going, as she knows, like that person is gonna need medical care for the rest of their life. It is a heavy decision to make, and to say
there's lots of medical conditions that have to be treated and monitored for the rest of your life. That's just the luck of the draw. That's just reality. There's lots of things that people will need treatment from every day for the rest of their life. This is not unique in that sense.
That kids can make that decision and it's totally fine. I just think it minimizes the seriousness of the decision. Let's just put.
You know what? There is no trans child that the decision is being minimized, that it's not being taken seriously, that they don't have to jump through 1,000 hoops, that they don't have to constantly prove over and over and over again that this surgery is needed eventually once they get to be old enough, that they are transgender. It is that they have to constantly push it on people and tell people, and so many people who are trans never get the puberty blockers, never get the hormone treatment, never end up getting the surgeries because they can't constantly prove it to people, because they need some sort of diagnosis. People won't just believe them because, oh, that's just how you feel inside. Well, sorry, that's not good enough. We're going to gatekeep you and tell you that you need to check all these boxes. You need to have psychiatric evaluations in order for you to know which gender you are. Okay, nobody who is trans is minimizing every hoop that they have to jump through in order to get the care that they need.
Put it that way. And then one final thing I'll note before I go to you, Jenk. I mentioned that she has undergone sex change surgery and she's written about it. Back in 2018, she wrote, my new vagina won't make me happy and it shouldn't have to. And in it she writes, next Thursday I will get a vagina. The procedure will last around 6 hours and I will be in recovery for at least 3 months. Until the day I die, my body will regard the vagina as a wound. As a result, it will require regular, painful attention to maintain. This is what I want, but there is no guarantee it'll make me happier. In fact, I don't expect it to. That shouldn't disqualify me from getting it. Now, her deciding to do this as an adult, it's your decision as an adult. She continues though, I feel demonstrably worse since I started on hormones. So she took hormone therapy. One reason is that absent my levies of the closet, years of repressed longing for the girlhood I never had have flooded my consciousness. I am a marshland of regret. Another reason is that I take estrogen, effectively delayed release sadness, a little aquamarine pill that more or less guarantees a good weep within 6 to 8 hours. So yeah, I've tried birth control that was heavier on the estrogen side. It made me suicidal. So the idea of giving that to kids, especially if you're gonna disregard their psychiatric history, is irresponsible to me.
Nobody is saying that we should give that to kids. No. And here's the thing, like, yes, hormone therapy will have issues and concerns and consequences, and especially when it comes to teenagers, and that needs to be monitored and looked after because you never know how it's going to interact with the person. But do you know what else? What other medication can cause suicidal ideation in teenagers? Antidepressants. That is a risk with some treatments, no matter what. And you have to weigh the pros and cons. Is a child more at risk if they don't receive the care that they need, or if they receive it? And quite often with trans children, when they receive that care, they are far better off mental health wise than if they're constantly denied it.
Yeah, look, when you apply any of this to kids, you're telling on yourself that you've never interacted with kids over a long period of time. I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. They are not fit to make adult decisions by a long shot, not even close.
Oh, so they don't have a gender then? They don't know what gender they are? So Jenk just has 2 children with no gender because they can't figure that out yet.
Because there's all sorts of hormones already flowing through their bodies. Their brains aren't fully developed. You know what they want to do all day? They want to watch iPads and iPhones, etc. Why? Because they haven't learned how to be mature yet and think about long-term thinking as opposed to short-term thinking. There's a million reasons why everyone who's ever interacted with a child knows this. And you think that not only should they be free to do it at any age, for any reason, at any time, but that none of us should be able to say, hey, wait, I'm not sure that's a great idea. What if a child decided, hey, you know what, I'm gonna play with a chainsaw, right? And they're 7 years old or 11 years old. Should we all be like, no, they have a right to do anything they like, that's okay, totally fine. No, put the chainsaw down, hold on, what are you doing? That's
not even a comparable analogy. Like, what did the chainsaw have to do with any sort of internalized feeling of who you are, self-identity? A tool used by adults that has an instruction manual and safety precautions that need to be used in order to use it. Like that's not a comparable use of an analogy there.
Right? Now in this case, it might work out and it might not work out, and you have to be super careful and you have to regulate it, and responsible people.
Everyone is super careful about children who receive gender-affirming care.
Actually do this right. And it's not for us to interfere with any family's decisions. But for you to say, and at one point in the piece, she of course argues against the parents knowing.
Come on.
As we went over, it was about not outing children to parents, which means those children are afraid that their parents will be abusive should they know.
So without the parents knowing, you think that little children should make massive decisions that whether it's, I mean, let's stick with the hormone therapy, that you.
It's not without the parents knowing. She even acknowledges in the article that it has to be tied to parental consent, that there's no way around it at this point. And that parents are a part of the process. She acknowledges it in the article. All she is saying is that you do not out trans children to their parents if they're scared. It's not saying, oh, well, we should give all the hormone therapy and all the decisions and everything to this child without telling their parents. That is not what she said.
Yourself say makes you depressed.
Let me give you graphic age. She even wrote, I was not suicidal before hormones. Now I often am.
No.
Okay, so about that article. So what Anna just did was she just took a random sentence out of this and put it way out of context as to what she was saying. And so this is the article that my new vagina won't make me happy. And basically she's saying that, she shouldn't have to prove again, that there's some sort of psychological issue or need that she has to get this done in order to just have the surgery in order to identify with who she is. And that the surgery in itself won't solve all of her problems, won't be the magic cure to make her happy, but it is just who she is and wants to get it done. Now, if we go down to where that sentence is, I was not suicidal before hormones. Now I often am. Well, there's 2 paragraphs before that, and one paragraph Anna read. I feel demonstrably worse since I started hormones. One reason is the absence of the levies of the closet, years of repressed longing for the girlhood I never had, and flooded my consciousness. I am a marshland of regret. So we heard that paragraph, followed by, Like many of my trans friends, I've watched my dysphoria balloon since I began transition. I now feel very strongly about the length of my index finger, enough that I will sometimes shyly untether my hand from my girlfriend's as we walk down the street when she tells me I'm beautiful. I resent it. I've been outside. I know what beautiful looks like. Don't patronize me. I was not suicidal before hormones. Now I often am. I won't go through with it, probably. Killing is icky. I tell you this not because I'm cruising for sympathy, but to prepare you for what I'm telling you now. I still want all this, all of it. I want the tears. I want the pain. Transition doesn't have to make me happy for me to want it. Left to their own devices, people will rarely pursue what makes them feel good in the long term. Desire and happiness are independent agents. She is saying that the hormones alone isn't what made her feel suicidal. It was the fact that she was now feeling who she is for the first time and the regret of not being able to have the puberty of her identity, to have made her into the woman that she now has features on her that aren't very feminine, and she's embarrassed by them, and she holds them back, that she'll never be considered beautiful, a beautiful girl. And even when her girlfriend tells her that, she doesn't believe it because she knows what beautiful people looks like. And because she was never able to have that the puberty of who she was, she will always, not quite fit in, not look like the person she was meant to look like. And that it's the regret of not being able to have all of those years as being a girl, of feeling what it's like to have that estrogen in her body. That is what's causing a lot of the suicidal feelings in her, of all of that heavy regret. And the hormones that, just help her to bring out those emotions and what it feels like to be a woman. It's the regret of not having that her life is what's making her feel suicidal.
Guys,
so kids, if they believe that they're transgender, without their parents knowing, should have access to things like the very hormones that make her suicidal.
She never once said that. Never. That was not in any of the articles. It is not about going behind the parents' back to help children go through transition against you feel like a girl? Well, let's not tell your parents that, and let's just start giving you all the hormones and puberty blockers and everything, and let's just do the surgery now. Let's do that all behind the parents' back. That is not what is happening. That is not what she's saying.
Yeah, so now some people will watch this and they'll say, oh, they're trying to ban trans people.
No.
Hold on. So you heard us in this video say the exact opposite. Adults can do anything they want. We support, not only do we support their right to do that, we support all of their rights. And we fight for their rights, and we fight the Republicans and the right wing, et cetera, on all that. But if you say—
unless it comes to sports teams. Because Cenk and Ana are very vocal about the fact that, well, maybe trans women shouldn't be on women's sports teams. That's pushing it. We're going to concede to the right on that, that trans women shouldn't be on sports team because, they're biologically male. But also, if they had transitioned when they were teenagers, then, there would be no— biologically, the difference is it's not there. They don't develop the strong muscles, the body frame. Everything changes if they get to have the puberty they identify with. But, if you hold it off and you say you can't do that you have to wait until after puberty, you are condemning them to a life of always feeling like they're out of place, of always never having the body that they wanted. That is the irreversible change that so many trans people go through, that they can't just go back in time and undo their puberty. And why it's so important that if a child says that they're trans, we believe them instead of making it so nearly impossible for them to get the treatment that they need. Yes, there should always be checks and balances, and it can't just be a simple, oh, you say so, so we're going to do it. There has to be procedures in place. but they shouldn't be so overwhelming that it can't be done for so many people. And in the States, it's not just children anymore. They're making these barriers in place for adults as well. So that as soon as you're adult, well, then you have to have this psychological treatment and you have to do this. Or if you are somehow deemed to have any sort of mental health illness, then you can't transition because you're not capable of making those decisions. Constantly over and over, they are finding ways to deny people the right to transition. And when you have people like Cenk and Ana on this show conceding little points here and there, like sports teams and all that sort of stuff, they are feeding into the right-wing narrative. They are making it easy for the right wing to then enforce their bigoted ways onto other people. Cenk and Ana are not helping the trans people around them. They're not helping the movement. They are making it worse.
Say to me, kids can make these absolutely life-altering decisions at any age. That is not a defensible position, and she didn't even bother defending it. She didn't explain a single reason.
She didn't have to defend it because it wasn't in the fucking article.
Why the kids would have the ability to do this and how it might be positive for the kids. It was just incredibly lazy as an argument. And then she gratuitously throws in people with psychiatric histories. Again, someone close to me was schizophrenic. He thought that he was Muhammad and Jesus combined. You think that we should let him get a sex change operation during when? When he was himself, Muhammad or Jesus?
Not comparable. Not comparable. Very, very, that is its own thing. Being schizophrenic, that is a completely different thing. It has nothing to do with gender. And Jenk saying, oh, so what? Should we allow him to have the sex change when he thinks he's Muhammad or Jesus? I'm sorry. Why? So because you think you're a person of the same gender, we're going to give you a sex? What? Like, where is this coming from?
Come on, you're not even trying to make sense. And her whole argument boiled down to, if I'm offended, then I am right. No.
Did anyone get that feeling from anything that we just covered? That she has that type of attitude that I might say Cenk and Ana often have themselves? That if you don't agree with me, then you're wrong. And you know, if you're offended, then that means I'm right.
That's not how it works. We all work in the world of logic. If you say, I don't care about logic, all I care about is my feelings and being offended, that is not a rational argument, and I dismiss you. So if you try to make sense, then we can have a rational argument. But if your argument is, well, if you offend me, then I must be right, that is just totally irrational. Makes no sense at all. And no, I do not agree to any of this. And so, and the last thing, guys, is if you care about trans rights, as we do.
I hope that the people watching do not care about trans rights the same way as Cenk and Ana do.
When someone becomes this extreme and becomes kind of the stereotype that the right wing presented as if it's all of us, they hurt our cause. They hurt the cause of trans rights because all the right wing point to this person and go, that's how they all are. And look at that, they're coming for your children and they want to be able to do this at 3 and 7, etc. But that is not the majority of the movement at all. But when she says it, well, I'm trans, so if I say that it must stand for every single person who supports trans rights, that's not true at all. 2/3 of the country supports trans rights. So you don't speak for everyone. And I know that hurts your feelings, but and if you don't know that the great majority of this country is against that, and even the great majority of people who are totally in favor of trans rights are against children of any age and people with any psychiatric disorder doing this, then you're being totally disingenuous. You do not represent the majority of the movement at all. So please get back to
Cenk has no fucking idea anything about the movement of trans rights. He has no clue whatsoever. Him having a friend who has a daughter who is trans does not give him any sort of agency in this discussion at all. He's talking about her being disingenuous when he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. He didn't bother to actually read the article in context. He skimmed through it and took words out of it that fit his narrative and stuck with it. At no point did she say that she would be offended and that if you don't agree with her, then you're an anti-trans horrible person. She never once said that children should be having surgery. None of that. And yet here they are, painting this columnist as some sort of radical extremist that thinks that it's okay for a toddler to undergo a sex change operation. So then anyone in their audience who didn't bother to read the article because they're just taking their word for it because it is a very long article, which actually helps Cenk and Ana, because once you get to it, who's going to bother to read that whole thing? So they're just going to take them at face value. So anyone who's watching this and believes Cenk and Ana now thinks that this woman is a horrible woman and doesn't know what the fuck she's talking about when her arguments seemed pretty clear to me once you read the whole fucking article.
Reality and sanity so we could fight for rights effectively and not be caricatures that the right wing pretended we were.
All right, we got to take a break. When we come back.
Yeah, so now let's move on to news about Trump is what happens. So 20 minutes talking about this column out of context, disingenuously. And yet I went to their YouTube channel and I typed in their search, Next Benedict. Do you know how many segments I found on that? 0. Okay, so they are choosing editorially to pick this story. They misrepresent it. And they do this instead of, I don't know, maybe covering this. The VA secretary has released a ruling transgender veterans will not be given gender reassignment surgery medical benefits. This move is sure to raise questions about the Biden administration's commitment towards transgender people. They didn't cover that. How about this? This is why you can never compromise with bigots. The parameters of your freedom, they'll take every inch until you have given them a mile. In Georgia restricts transgender care for youth in 2023. Now Republicans are seeking an outright ban. How about this? Rainbow panic is coming for marriage equality. You didn't think they would start and end with trans kids playing soccer, did you? Because apparently this dumbass Michael Knowles is now saying, you know what, a union should only be between a man and a woman. We shouldn't be having any sort of queer marriages at all whatsoever, because of course it escalates. It's never just about trans people, just like it's not about the children. Or how about this one? GOP bill would require teachers to register as sex offenders if they support trans students. Where is their coverage on those? Like, these will have absolute impacts, like something like this. It's because of bills like this, it's because of attention like this, that Next felt like he had no other alternative. He was being bullied by the kids at his school, by the teachers, by the government officials making laws about who he could be. Where are the stories about that? No, they just pick this one fucking article and not read it properly and then try to tell people it says things it doesn't say. They are harming the cause when they do shit like this. This paragraph here to me really kind of sums it up to them, that the most insidious source of the anti-trans movement in the country is quite simply liberals. People like Cenk and Ana that just think that a lot of this talk is nothing but social justice warrior bullshit and that, you know, we shouldn't be leaving. But it's like they're trying to say that they're coming from a place of compassion, that they understand what trans people are going for. After all, this is our battle. No, the fuck isn't. It is not Cenk's and Ana's battle. They are there for support. That's what they do. They do not fight this cause. We fight it. You know, people who are queer and trans and non-binary like me, we fight it. You support. That's what you do. You do not speak on our behalf. You do not then find some columnist and put words in her mouth and go through an entire long, like, you take the time to read this article, but then you skip through it in such a way that you butcher it. Like, why bother reading any of it at that point? Like, this is just such bullshit that they are out there, that they have such a large audience, that they are spewing this nonsense, and that all of the people who are queer presenters on their network seem to be disappearing for some reason. So there's nobody there to really push back and counter what they're saying on the show. Do you think Anna will ever have on somebody who is actually trans to talk about trans issues? No. You know, you think she's ever going to sit down and go on one of their shows? Do you think she would ever come on my show? Of course not. It drives me crazy that they are supposed to be the home of progressives. And this is the bullshit that they are putting out there. They are helping the right-wing cause. They are making it harder for trans people, for trans kids in particular, for trans women. They are making their lives more difficult. And again, it is an editorial choice that they choose this story out of all of the stories. The legislation that will impact millions. That is a story worth covering, not just some opinion piece in a magazine by somebody you didn't even know existed yesterday. It is. And all the people who go on watch that show now are just telling me how horrid the comment sections are. They are cultivating an audience of TERFs. They are making it inhospitable to people who are trans and queer in their audience. But they will never sit down with us because we're too radical. We're too out there. We don't think, we don't, think with logic or anything of that sort. No, we just think with emotions. That's all it's about. Just absolute, complete garbage coming out of them. And it's like, when they do things like this, it makes me question everything else they present. Is it just performative? Everything? Because earlier in that show, Anna was literally in tears over what was happening in Gaza because Cenk and Ana seemed to be on the right side of that issue. And she was actually in tears after watching one of the videos. So am I to take that seriously, or is she just being performative yet again? Like anything they say, like when they show to be so disingenuous in their takes on an issue, in their reading of an article, how can you believe anything else that they're taking? Like if they refer to any other article, how can you trust it? I used to really admire that network. I was so proud to be part of it. And even now what they're doing, it doesn't take away what I felt when I was there. The accomplishment and everything that I did. But god damn it, if they won't even listen to us anymore, the people who are part of their network. 0PE, I wish they would just not even do these stories. The fact that they still, considering their obvious bias, expose their grift. Yeah, that was something that I forgot to mention that, and I've said it in other videos, that at this point, the best thing they can do is nothing. Just don't cover the subject. If all you're going to do is this and pick these random stories, just don't cover the issue. This isn't something that they're passionate about. It's not something that they can relate to personally. There's nothing wrong if they don't cover the issue. And it's better for everyone if they don't. Cenk and Ana should never talk about trans rights again. Never. And that alone would benefit the trans movement far better than them ever doing another story on them again. Donald James X, I do believe Jenk would pass pro-trans laws if he was POTUS. I just do. There is no reason to think otherwise yet. I agree with you. I believe in Jenk's heart of hearts, he wants to do what's right. He's just doing it wrong. It's like my mom, with my mental health issues and stuff like that. When she would try to help me in my early 20s in particular, everything she did was more detrimental to me than beneficial. But I knew in her heart of hearts she was trying to do what she thought was useful to me. I don't believe Jenk is a horrible person. I just don't think he has the understanding to speak on this subject that he knows, and he doesn't bother to learn enough to accept information as it comes to him. But I absolutely believe that if he were to be POTUS, he would make it so that all trans adults could have surgery and care and that there'd be no restrictions and all that sort of stuff. I'm not too sure what he would do about sports. Like, I do think the States would be in a far better place for trans rights if somebody like him were in power, but it wouldn't be the be-all and end-all, and there would still be a lot of work that needs to be done. So it gets into the nuance and the nitty-gritty. I think Jenk is for trans rights, but his actions are anti-trans. What he's doing is actively anti-trans. So it is complicated, and it goes back to what Sam Cedar says. It doesn't matter, what you think in your heart at heart. It's all that matters is what you present to the world. And currently what Jenk is presenting to the world is not good when it comes to trans issues. So basically, it doesn't matter that I think Jenk isn't anti-trans. All that matters is the stances he is currently taking is harming trans people. 0PE, TYT loves things out of context. Certain subjects, they absolutely do. And, it's almost easier if it's consistent, like if they're always out of context, because then but when they're right on some issues and wrong on the others, then it can really make it difficult to figure out which is which, especially if you're a fan of the show who doesn't get much in the way of other coverage on these issues. Because, like I said, from everything I've seen, they're on the right side of the issue with Gaza, and very strongly on the right side of that issue. But when it comes to trans people, crime, housing, things of that sort, wow, are they ever off. 0PE, how do you do a trans segment when there are no trans people to refer to? He just speaks for the whole community he doesn't even belong to. Defer to, yeah. Yeah, like even when Benny was on there, I don't think I ever saw her on the main show where they were talking about trans issues. Like, I know Ravana covered queer issues from time to time when she was on the main show, not when Anna was on there, usually a Friday show. But, like, you never saw Cenk and Ana talk to Benny. Granted, Cenk did talk to me on the discussion, on the conversation, but that's not exactly main show content there. But yeah, they're constantly having these conversations about trans people without actually talking to trans people. It's weird how that happens. The Emo Dragon. Hey, Sandy, glad that I got you. I came in late, so I may have to restart the stream over. Their comment section was a dumpster fire on that video. I can imagine. Yes, everyone, blame Emo Dragon for this segment that is going on. This is the longest live stream I've done by far.